In the not-too-distant past, when people believed in fairy tales, there lived in an empire a man nicknamed the Grim Reaper. With just one glance, he could turn a person into ashes. That's what they said about him. For the sake of the country, this monster did not hesitate to stain his hands with blood. A terrible tyrant and an angel of death who knows no mercy. In the empire, this monster was called His Grace Chiron, Archduke of Triton. Having disembarked from the ship not far from the desired castle, Chiron and the soldiers immediately began their assault. Scattering soldiers defending his archduchy, his lordship approached the building. He never hid behind the backs of his warriors, always in the forefront, setting an example and inspiring his knights. And now the duke was the first to enter the castle, leaving behind bloody corpses. One of the dead turned out to be almost a boy, over whom his father was already bending over, mourning. He asked the angel of death why his son was killed and for what. Chiron came closer. The blood of the slain, still wet, dripped from his sword onto the floor. The metal elements on his armor sparkled in the rays of the sun, adding mystery to the whole image. The man with the mustache exclaimed with tears in his eyes why the duke had treated them so cruelly. He did not understand what kind of uprising they were talking about. The gray-haired man claimed that he had been framed and that all these years he had dutifully served His Majesty. His lordship, taking a step further, replied that he did not know. All he knows is that the emperor wants to wipe out the Archduchy of Barton from the face of the earth. The man rose to his knees, letting go of his son's corpse. Chiron raised his sword and invited the Archduke to stop resisting. Barton responded by shouting that the invader was just the emperor's watchdog. And then he called him despicable because he served such a pitiful master. The warrior clenched his jaw. The gray-haired man was still shouting that Triton would burn in hell for his sins, but the sword was already raised. His lordship cut the owner of the castle in the chest with one blow and he flew off to the wall. Chiron noticed that he suggested not to resist. He could at least die with dignity. The mustachioed man coughed in his death throes. The warrior stepped over his body and opened the door. The room that presented itself greatly surprised the man. It was filled with various trophies, skins, and stuffed animals. In the center of the room stood something very large covered with a burgundy cape. His Excellency, looking around the room, was surprised that it was he who would need to burn in hell, in Barton's opinion. He doubted that the owner of such a collection was destined for a place in heaven. Suddenly, a knock was heard from behind the covered box. Chiron came closer and tugged at the fabric. Directly in front of him, he saw a face pressed against the glass with huge blue eyes. The tank was filled with water, and in it was a woman with long pink hair and a fishtail. "This is a mermaid." And this creature looked at the Duke and blinked. Chiron froze, looking at her. A subordinate entered the room looking for his lordship. He began to say that they had cleared almost the entire castle, but the Duke stopped him with a wave of his hand, without taking his eyes off the woman. The servant came closer and shuddered. Stuttering a little, the man tried to say that it was a mermaid. Triton had heard that Barton was an avid collector of curiosities, but he would never have thought that the Archduke had managed to capture a creature from fairy tales. The subordinate, still stuttering a little, noted that the collection is the 10th thing, but if you hurt the mermaid, you can die. In any case, that's what they say in the legends. Maybe that's why the mustachioed man died. Chiron replied that Barton died because he started a rebellion, and some fish had nothing to do with it. At this time, the mermaid looked straight at the men, opening her mouth and trying to say, "Help." She tapped her scratched hands on the glass. But people didn't pay much attention to her and continued to discuss what to do next. The chief said that we would take everything with us. Every speck of dust in this castle now belongs to His Majesty. The servant clarified about the mermaid. His lordship replied that the mermaid too, and that the other rooms also needed to be examined. The siren in the aquarium turned her head in all directions. Without thinking of anything else, she hit the glass with her shoulder as hard as she could. This wounded her and some blood was distributed in the water. The warriors turned their attention to her. The Duke crossed his arms over his chest and looked at the curiosity with interest. The subordinate tensed a little. He asked the gentleman why he thought she wanted to attack them. After all, if the mermaid does not stop, then she can kill herself. The girl banged her fists on the glass, blood oozing from her wounds. Triton reached for his sword. He suggested that perhaps the Undine wanted to join her master. The servant was nervous and asked the owner if he would kill her. Chiron took out his sword and tapped on the glass. He replied, "Why not? His Majesty gave the order to kill every inhabitant of this castle. His lordship ran his blade across the glass. The warrior asked to wait, but the Duke swung and slashed at the aquarium with all his might. There was a terrible crash. The glass burst and all the contents spilled into the room. The mermaid managed to grab the main man by the lapels and plopped right into his arms. Sitting up a little, the two stared at each other. Yellow eyes opposite blue. Kieran raised his hand and extended it to the girl's face. He didn't even notice that those eyes. His fingers removed the water from her face. Serena smiled, her eyes sparkling, and she squeezed the Duke's hand with hers. This is a story about the recent past. The story of a mythical mermaid and her only person, her serenade. The mermaid's eyes were so blue that you could drown in them. The girl extended her wounded hand to Kieran, but the man managed to intercept it, still not letting go of the Undine. The Duke turned to his subordinate Ian and asked him to put her in some container with water and bring her back to him without any questions. Triton went into the office. This is his second time in this room. When His Excellency stood near the work table and touched the figurine, memories came flooding back to him. Many years ago, when Kieran was still a teenager, he stood in this same place with the king. A little further, near the fireplace, a man knelt down. He said, stuttering a little, that the kingdom of Barton would lay down its arms and become the Archduchy of Barton. They swear to serve the king faithfully. The Lord begged His Majesty to have mercy on them. The Emperor called the boy and ordered him to watch carefully. On the table stood a figurine depicting several men entwined with snakes. The king pushed this sculpture to the floor. It broke into several fragments, just like today's statue. Already an adult Triton muttered that this place was as disgusting as before. John entered and addressed his lordship. They brought a mermaid. It was ordered to bring her in containers of water, but the Duke chuckled and quipped about the fact that she had grown legs. The servant confirmed that the creature turned as soon as the last drops of water dried on her. And indeed, the girl stood on 2 legs, supported by the knight's arms. Her body was trembling. As soon as she was released, she plopped onto the floor. Kieran grabbed her chin and lifted her face. He concluded that a fish can turn into a person. The siren's body was still trembling. The Duke said that Barton kept a rather interesting piece of art in his castle. He began to slowly turn the girl's head in different directions, examining her. Then he noticed that the mermaid's entire body was covered in tattered wounds. The man asked Jan what it was, and why there were so many abrasions on it. War trophies must be handled with care, so he asked the servant to take better care of the siren. The guy was a little nervous because it wasn't his fault. The wounds were already on her body when his lordship broke the aquarium. Perhaps they were left behind by the former owner. The mermaid's eyes grew dim and she began to tremble even more. The girl remembered how Barton pulled her out of the tank and whipped her with a whip. He kept saying that mermaids shed pearly tears. Therefore, the owner beat her more and more to make her cry in pain. He shouted at her to cry, otherwise he would beat her half to death. Undine was mired in terrible memories. Her eyes were wide open. Therefore, she did not immediately hear that they were addressing her. Kieran lifted her head back up by the chin, and when their eyes met, he asked if she could hear him. His Excellency was simply mesmerized by the girl's eyes. He gently stroked her cheek with his fingers. He likes those eyes. Siren tried to mutter something, but Ian tried to push the gentleman away with his hand. He asked him to leave. The knights behind also tensed and drew their swords. Triton asked what they were doing. The servant apologized and explained that they say that the voice of a mermaid steals a person's soul. The commander-in-chief became angry. He told Ian that he would stop talking about fairy tales. The servant had already disturbed His Excellency once by talking about them. The guy mumbled guiltily that it was better to be on the safe side than... At this time, the Undine made several vowel sounds. The men all jumped in surprise. The knights rushed with their swords. Yang also reached for the scabbard. But the Duke stopped them with a wave of his hand. Meanwhile, the girl continued to make sounds. I heard eti and ochu. The Duke asked again. The mermaid squeezed his cape and said the word is, and then added that she wanted. Serena said again, but more clearly that she wanted to eat, and then added feed. Kieran asked the servant if he had heard. The guy confirmed that yes, the girl asked to feed her. His lordship laughed loudly. This greatly surprised everyone present, especially the warriors. They had never seen the commander-in-chief laugh. The Duke lifted the mermaid's face by the chin. He never thought that he would receive such an interesting trophy. The man asked Yang if he wasn't curious what would happen if they brought her to the Empire. The ship glided along the watery surface of the sea. Triton stood on the captain's bridge and gave orders. He ordered to raise the sails, since the tailwind would soon increase. The sailors immediately began to fuss on deck and began to tighten the ropes. The sails opened and were immediately filled with wind. With the sails at full speed, the ship began to pick up speed, cutting through the waves at full speed. A servant came up to the captain. He cleared his throat and began to say that they had been on the road for a long time and had not only subdued the nomads who were always attacking the western border, but also suppressed Barton's rebellion. It turns out that the team left the gates of Triton Castle almost 6 months ago. Kieran was already beginning to lose patience and urged Ian to quickly get to the heart of the matter. The guy was clearly nervous and began to stutter a little. His Excellency once again reprimanded the servant, ordering him not to pull the cat by the tail, but to get down to business. The subordinate said that this was regarding the mermaid. Soon the ship will enter the waters of Bercez. Perhaps she will be released there. For His Majesty ordered that no prisoners should be taken at Barton Castle. The Duke thought about it because in fact she is not a person, but a fish. It can be kept as a representative of another species. Ian was very surprised and clarified that it was like a pet. Kieran did not answer but only asked what the girl was doing. Then the Lord chuckled, crossed his arms over his chest and began to savor the phrase, "my fish." And he clearly liked it. The men went down to the cabin where the siren was located. She sat with her arms wrapped around herself, shaking violently. Triton asked what was wrong with her. The servant replied that perhaps the Undine was uncomfortable in clothes. She constantly pulls and tears her dress. My lord noticed that the mermaid was very pale. He ordered to feed her something before sailing. John replied that they gave her the fish that was in the castle. His lordship was surprised. The servant explained that in the room where the creature was kept there were buckets of fish. They decided that they were feeding her with this, so they gave the siren their contents. The captain asked again that the fish was raw. The subordinate responded positively. It is unlikely that a mermaid will eat soup or fried meat. Kieran sat down next to the girl. He touched her face. Undine shuddered. The man ordered her not to twitch. He pressed his jaw and opened the mermaid's mouth slightly. Curious. Her mouth is warm and her face is unhealthy, as if dying. The creature coughed a little. Ian asked what to do. Maybe we should release her into the sea, not yet. Then the mermaid moaned. Water. The Duke barked at the servant. What is he worth? The girl asks for water. The subordinate explained that they were trying to give her water, but she didn't touch it, even when there was just a decanter of water standing nearby. The servants brought a jug of water. Triton replied that the creature is a mermaid, and she needs water not only to quench her thirst. Ian did not understand what the gentleman meant. Then my lord simply poured all the water directly on the girl. The mermaid took a deep breath. Water dripped from it onto the floor. The Duke asked how she was, if she was feeling better. Siren muttered a thank you. She extended her hand and wanted to say something else. But the captain had already turned away and was giving orders. He ordered a third assistant to be called to look after the Undine, and also to call his lordship when she feels better. Just as the captain was about to leave, he heard a faint, "Don't go." He froze. The creature grabbed his leg and begged him to stop. The Duke turned to the girl. She wanted to say something, but she couldn't do it well. Kieran concluded that he has no desire to take on an animal that requires a lot of time. But still, he leaned towards the mermaid. She reached out her hand to him and touched his face. Then she put her other hand around his neck. The man began to say what the hell she allows herself, but the siren's finger touched his lips. Their gazes met and her eyes sparkled. The girl whispered to him not to leave. The hand touching his face began to weaken and the mermaid somehow slowly began to slide down. His lordship only managed to catch her before she flopped onto the floor. Undine lay unconscious in his arms. Her breathing was barely noticeable. The lord did not understand at all what was happening. Under a huge moon, 2 mermaids sat on a boulder in the sea and talked. The eldest explained to her fellow tribesmen that she must kill him before she went to bed. The siren will understand what they are talking about now when she meets her serenade. The younger one asked again. She would definitely understand when she saw it, since at the moment she did not understand anything. Our Undine remembered this conversation when she first saw Kieran behind the glass of the aquarium. She looked at him very closely. Black hair, wide eyebrows, dark eyelashes, yellow eyes, regular facial features, tall, fit body. The mermaid was looking for a serenade that will always live in her memory. When she meets him, she will be able to give birth to the most beautiful mermaid. But the Undine was caught in the net by Barton's sailors. She was terribly scared then. A bunch of dirty men crowded around her, laughing loudly and pointing. Siren injured her fingers while trying to rip the nets, and around there are black faces and torches. The girl woke up from a nightmare. She felt the water. Having gathered life-giving moisture into her palms, the mermaid realized that this was the sea. Joyful thoughts swirled in her head that she had finally returned to the ocean. A man's voice said that she had a tail again. Siren shuddered. This man again. She finally came to her senses and looked back. The girl saw that she was still in the same cabin but in the bathroom. The Duke stood a little further away against the wall, leaning on the table. He held a glass in his hand, which he placed on the table. Undine turned to him. The question in my head was whether he had put it in the water. She also wanted to thank him, but she didn't know how to do it in human language. Meanwhile, Kieran was approaching the bath. He asked the creature if she was feeling better. She nodded. It seems that it was not in vain that he forced Ian to fill the container with water from the ocean. His lordship sat down on a chair nearby and touched the mermaid's forehead. The man asked if she understood him at all. Then the lord remembered the words from the legend that if you hurt a mermaid, you can die. So this is a curse to death. The girl looked at my lord so naively and at ease that he thought that this creature was too stupid-looking to impose such a curse. At this time, the Undine looked at her reflection in the water. Siren splashed the water, and this amused her. Triton unfastened his sheath and began to make a whirlpool in the water. The girl watched carefully, and then abruptly caught the weapon with her palms. The man wanted to ask what she was doing, but the mermaid began to laugh. The Duke did not know how to behave. He wanted to take the scabbard, but the Undine held it tightly. My lord remembered his childhood. When his mother read him stories about mermaids, she warned the boy. Mermaids are very beautiful, but you don't need to be charmed by their appearance. They seduce men by singing and cast illusions on them that drive everyone crazy. Then the image of the dying Barton appeared in my head, who said the way you are now. He drove away the obsession. The sheath opened in the siren's hands and a knife blade appeared. The girl was interested in the shiny metal. She extended her hands towards him and began to stroke the steel. Kieran asked her to remove her hands, but the mermaid did not pay attention. Then he said more sharply. The Undine shuddered and looked at the man. She repeated the word, "Put away." But she hesitated and cut herself on the blade. There was blood. Serena felt a strong burning sensation. This thing was clearly designed to cause terrible pain. The Duke grabbed his head. Even parrots know more words. His lordship decided to teach her the language while they were on the ship. He stood up and headed towards the exit. The mermaid looked after him. She mentally asked him why he was leaving. It probably frightens him that she can't speak. The girl extended her hand to him, mentally begging not to leave and promising to study hard. But Triton did not hear her thoughts. He went out and slammed the door. Kieran and his retinue galloped on a horse through the streets of the capital. The people bowed before the procession. Behind him was a large closed carriage drawn by a pair of horses. One of the knights tried to look inside. He asked the vice commander what was in the cart, but Ian replied that, unfortunately, the chief forbade talking about it. The warrior sighed in disappointment. The Duke noticed that the townspeople were still afraid of him. People trembled, looking down. It seemed that the warriors had come not with victory, but with the goal of capturing them. Rumor has it that one look into the commander's eyes turns a man to ashes. Yang exhaled loudly. The late emperor greatly ruined my lord's life. He contributed to his lordship's image as the ultimate Grim Reaper. The subject looked around. He understood that these were just empty conversations and there was no point in attaching importance to them. After all, everything will calm down soon. Exactly, everything will be fine. The cart rumbled and clattered along the stone streets. A hand appeared from under the cover inside the cart, and then the face of a curious mermaid. The maid Anna walked along the corridors of the palace. He was carrying a full bucket of raw fish and squid. Another worker called out to her and asked where she was going. The girl replied that she needed to look into the kitchen. Another maid joined the conversation. They asked about the kitchen and at such an hour. The women began to laugh openly. Then they quipped that she already needed to be fed. The maids feigned regret that the girl had only been here for a few months, but had to do such hard work every day. Anna smiled. It's not that bad. The workers doubted it. They just heard about everything. All the maids are just talking about this, how they find a free moment to stand together. They say that his lordship brought his mistress here. And not just an ordinary one, but a real mermaid. Anna frowned at these words. The women continued to talk about how sirens kill people with their songs. It's not even like that. People die just by hearing their voice and the like. The girl had already stopped listening to them and went on about her business. She was angry with the chatty maids. After all, if mermaids were capable of killing with just their voices, then Anna would have been lying in the ground long ago. She knocked on the door and entered the room. In the room, a pink-haired mermaid sat in a large pool of water. The maid apologized for being late. Ondine was delighted with the visitor and said hello, but did not address her by her full name, but simply Anne. The maid approached the pool with a bucket. She corrected the siren that her name was Anna, not Anne. The mermaid clarified and called Anne. The maid called Anna again. Then she breathed out helplessly. The lady is so good at other words, but for some reason her name is not one of them. Ondine laughed, leaning her elbows on the railing of the tank. All she did was sit all day in the water and chew raw fish. The worker moved the bucket of fish closer and offered to help us. She noticed that last time the mermaid liked squid, so today she brought more. The water nymph took the squid out of the bucket and happily said thank you. Anna was glad that the lady remembered the words of gratitude. Footsteps were heard outside the door. The mermaid froze with the squid in her hands. The maid asked if the girl was waiting for someone. The siren repeated, "Waiting." The maid explained that in other words it means wanting to see someone. If you think about it this way, then when the lady mermaid arrived, Count Jan von Luthern often came to see her in the first months. Therefore Anna asked that perhaps the Undine was waiting for Jan. The girl repeated the name. She thought that perhaps her black-haired savior's name was Yang. Remembering him, her cheeks turned pink, which was noticed by the maid. The worker sat down on the side of the pool. She asked the nymph what she liked so much about him, his beauty or his noble birth. The mermaid repeated the word like, and then she joyfully exclaimed that yes, I like Ian. Anna began stroking the siren's hair. She noticed that the count had completely stopped visiting her. Then why did she love him? The girl became completely thoughtful. The maid asked her to turn around. She wanted to braid her hair. Ondine remembered how Kieran touched her hair and face. She thinks about him all the time now. He is her man, her serenade. Everything is as the sisters said. Only when she saw this man, the mermaid immediately realized that he was hers. That's why she waits for him no matter how long it takes. Waiting is nothing for the nymph. The maid had her pink hair braided in a thick braid. She said she would go away for a minute to get her hair jewelry. Ondine nodded. The sisters taught her that she had to wait a very long time to receive her serenade. Carried away by her thoughts, the mermaid plunged into the water and blew bubbles with her nose. There was a knock on the door. Siren turned, thinking that it was Anna who had returned, but Triton entered the room. He asked who she was waiting for. The man leaned over and sat down on the side. The nymph was confused and looked straight at him. Kieran said she looked funny and hadn't learned to speak yet. Then he asked why she was without a tail again. The girl asked a new word for her. My lord touched her feet, indicating that he was here. The mermaid thought about it. Since she arrived here, the girl has not been able to turn into a mermaid. She wondered what was the matter. Maybe because of the water, it doesn't have the same smell as the sea. She mentally already called him Yang, but scooping the liquid into her hands and handing it to him, she said, "Water." His lordship did not understand what the nymph wanted to say. The siren despaired. She still extended her palms with moisture to him and shook her head. Then she said, "Yang, water." My lord frowned when he heard the count's name. The door knocked and a maid entered the room. She was afraid for her mistress and pushed the duke away from the pool with all her strength. Afterwards, Anna hugged the mermaid and screamed at the man, who he was, and how dare he burst into the girl's room when she was alone. And she added that the lord should leave immediately. His lordship got hit on the head, so he grabbed his forehead with his hand. He quickly stood up and indignantly asked how she dared to order him to leave. The maid still hugged her mistress, protecting her from the unfamiliar man. Kieran, still rubbing his forehead, asked if she was sure it was addressed to him. The maid started screaming. She shouted that she was completely sure. The mermaid tried to call her, but Anna continued to be indignant that what madman would dare. She didn't finish. The girl even shuddered at her guess. Stuttering, she addressed his lordship. The duke, still kneading the bruised parts of his body, asked if some new rule had been introduced here while he was away. Now he needs permission to see his property. The maid fell prostrate before my lord. She sincerely apologized since she had only recently worked at the castle and was unable to recognize the master. Her body was trembling with fear. Anna admitted that she deserved to die. Triton took the hilt of his sword. He acknowledged that the maid does her job well, but she must know whom she serves. The Lord drew his sword. The worker began to stutter even more, and tears began to flow from her eyes. Siren flinched at the sight of the steel blade. Shouting, "No!" She jumped out of the pool and hugged the man's hips. She repeated again, "Ian, no!" The nymph looked into Kieran's eyes and called him back Ian. Mentally, she asked him not to do anything. She remembered that it was a dangerous thing, made to hurt people. Then she said the words "no" and "thank you." My lord chuckled. He explained that in such a situation they do not say "thank you," but ask for a favor. His lordship leaned down and lifted the Undine's head by the chin. The mermaid repeated the word "service." The man noticed that the girl had learned new words. In vain he thought she was dumb. He then squeezed her forearm and summarized that there was some meat on the bones. Triton lifted the Undine. Looking into her eyes, he noted that now she even knows how to jump into his arms. My lord praised his fish. What should he do now? Since she stopped his blade, he will fulfill her wish. Kieran asked if the siren wanted him to kill this maid. She asked what kill meant. Anna shuddered and sobbed even more. She crossed her hands in supplication and asked him to have mercy and not kill her. Triton clarified, because the maid herself said that she deserved to die. The maid replied that she had made a mistake and begged him to forgive her. She will do anything, just spare her. The nymph muttered the word mercy. Kieran leaned close to the girl's ear and told her to try saying spare her. She must say it herself, and then he will leave Anna alive. His lordship took the mermaid by the arms above the elbows and ordered her to say, "I beg you, have mercy on her." Siren muttered, "Spare her," and then more loudly and clearly said "spare her" and added, "Please." The Duke leaned right into the Undine's face and ran his hand along her back. The girl called him Jan questioningly. My lord pushed the nymph away and condescendingly added that so be it, he would keep his word. But the worker must teach her to speak better. The maid moved closer to the mermaid and hugged her. Triton's property must know his name, and the lord hopes that next time he won't hear about any Jan. His lordship put the blade back into its sheath and headed towards the exit. Anna thanked and promised to teach the siren everything. Later in the evening, my lord lay on the couch. The count came to meet him. The subordinate bowed and said that he had heard about his meeting with the mermaid, and that the new maid was rude to the master. Ian apologized. He felt guilty for not training his staff properly. The Duke noted that rumors fly quickly. Then he added that she asked him to spare her. The count asked again. His lordship was fiddling with a bottle of medicine in his hands. He explained that the mermaid asked him for a favor, so she said, "Spare her, please." It's a little strange. He remembered Barton. There is nothing more nerve-wracking than seeing someone throw away the last of their pride and collapse at their feet, begging for mercy. But there was something special about this fish from the very minute he looked at it. There was something unusual. The guy wanted to clarify, but Kieran took a sip of medicine and said that the count could go. Yang noticed that lately the gentleman had become very addicted to this medicine. He was worried that this might affect his health. His lordship looked menacingly at his comrade. Is it really better for him to suffer from insomnia for the rest of his life than to become dependent on medication? So my lord barked at him not to force him to repeat it, but to simply leave. The count left. There was a throbbing sensation in my temples. Triton put his hand to his head and closed his eyes. Images immediately began to appear before my eyes. First, the Duke of Barton, who repeated that the Lord was just the Emperor's little dog. Then the pleading servant with tears in her eyes said that she did not want to die. Then another dying ghost called him and stretched his hands towards him. The last to appear was the image of a mermaid, who first asked to spare her. And then she touched his face and called him by name. Kieran opened his eyes. How tired he is of all this. On a beautiful sunny summer day, in one of the rooms of the castle, the slap of bare feet on the marble floor was heard. Siren practiced walking. Her legs trembled and her steps were not entirely confident, but she tried. Anna helped her mistress cope, encouraged her and, if necessary, supported her. Step by step, the nymph learned to walk. The maid was pleased, because today the mermaid took 2 steps more. Undine also rejoiced at her success, because now she will be able to go outside. It was amazing. After resting a little, the girl began to take steps again. The maid asked if the mistress still wanted to practice. The girl confirmed. The worker was touched by the mermaid's persistence. She reminded her of her brothers and sister. Anna came from a large family. She was the eldest. There were also 2 brothers and a sister. Siren repeated the words brothers, sisters. The family lived poorly, so the parents worked all day, and the maid had to take care of the younger ones. The maid changed their diapers, helped them take their first steps, and much more. But the children did not listen to her at all. And sometimes the girl was ready to literally tear her hair out, but they are family and she loves them. Anna then turned directly to the nymph. After all, if she had not stopped the Duke, the maid would never have seen them again. The maid thanked the lady and shed a little tears. Suddenly, some screams were heard very close by. Some blonde lady was cursing and practically fighting with the maids. She shouted that she wanted to stay another day and asked what was wrong with them. Anna hid the mistress behind a column. The maids told the ladies that they were just following orders. His lordship gave orders to send her home as soon as she woke up. The worker thought for a moment and guessed which woman the head maid was talking to. She whispered in the mermaid's ear that last night the lord invited a woman to his place. Apparently it was her. The mermaid asked what it meant to invite. Anna explained that this meant that they spent the night together. Siren was surprised and began to remember where she heard it. The sisters said that in order to give birth to a child, you need to spend the night with your serenade. The women's screaming continued. The maids tried to push the woman out, but she struggled. The maid thought. So the rumors are true. My lord always sends women home the morning after inviting them. Then she came to her senses and, pulling the mistress, suggested moving to another place. The mermaid tried to stop, but Anna carried her further and further. She wished she had been able to ask the lady what it was like to spend a night with a serenade. A decade ago, young Kiran stood on the battlefield next to the king. A man knelt in front of them with his hands tied behind his back. The boy held the bare blade and trembled all over. The emperor yelled at the boy. Why did he stand rooted to the spot? We need to finish him off already. Kiran shuddered, tears flowing from his eyes. He couldn't because this man was his mentor. The king was angry. He said that he doesn't teach the guy anymore. This is just a traitor who wanted to kill them by selling information to the enemy side. The boy still had doubts. He hoped that there might have been a misunderstanding. Kiran asked his brother, that is, His Majesty, still trembling and sobbing. The emperor gave him a resounding slap in the face. The boy staggered, touching the bruised area. The emperor wondered when his younger brother would become a normal member of the ruling dynasty. Then, pointing his finger at the man, he said that the emperor was ordering him or himself to be killed. It is necessary to prove that the guy is ready to stand next to the monarch. Or he still thinks he has a choice. Tears ran down the child's cheeks and dripped onto the ground. He raised his sword but still turned to Duncan. Kiran did not believe that his mentor could be a traitor. After all, he taught him for so many years and couldn't just forget about it. The man was silent. The boy shouted for Duncan to say that it was not his fault. Then the king's brother will do everything in his power. The mentor looked up at the student and told him to do what His Majesty ordered. There is no need to resist. The criminal awaits punishment. His Highness remembered one lesson. Duncan explained that the blade is the ruler's cane. He must always rely on it to get closer to what he wants. The sword was not created to blindly kill and maim people. And Kiran must take up the blade for the well-being of his people. The guy gathered his strength. His pupils narrowed. The tears had not yet dried in his eyes. With one blow of the sword, the enemy fell lifeless. His last words were that the Duke must survive. His lordship woke up from his memories and took a deep breath. He got up from the couch and walked over to open the window. Voices were heard on the street. Anna asked the Lady Mermaid to stop. My lord looked out the window. He saw a siren running down the path and giggling, and the maid was trying to catch up with her with shoes in her hands. She shouted that first she needed to put on her shoes. Late at night, another bottle of medicine fell to the floor with a clang. Kiran sat on the sofa, clutching his head. All these drugs were useless. No matter what he took, there was no result. The ghosts of the past still reached out to him and grabbed his legs. If his whole life goes like this... The Duke thought about it. He remembered the mermaid running merrily and his mother's words. Mermaids are more beautiful than any person, but you cannot be fooled by their appearance. They say they can take souls with their songs. The man smiled at the thought of stealing souls. Bowing his head, my lord muttered that perhaps it would be even better. Ian ran up to his lordship. Seeing a pile of broken glass around, he asked what was happening. The Lord looked at the Count with a dull look and said that he had come on time and asked to bring the mermaid immediately. The siren walked accompanied by a knight. His armor rang in the night silence of the castle, echoing throughout the room. The nymph leaned on the warrior's hand, but at some point her legs got tangled in a long dress. Siren stopped to lift her hem. The soldier asked what was wrong with her. The girl asked to wait a little. The man, looking at her eyes, blushed and turned away. He replied that the Duke ordered him to come immediately. The nymph wondered what it meant to come. The knight brought the mermaid to the master's chambers. He indicated that she needed to go there. She will go on without him. Just beyond the door is the living room, which you need to go through. Then turn right, and there will be his lordship's bedroom. The girl listened very carefully. When she finally arrived, Chiron met her there. He said he had to wait a long time for the siren. She stopped at the entrance and grabbed the partition. My lord was wearing a white shirt unbuttoned at the chest. His hair was disheveled and his gaze was hard. He asked if she had learned to walk. Undine beamed. Yes, she walked a lot. The Duke walked over to the bed and sat down on it. Then the man invited the mermaid to try to come straight to him. The girl concentrated and began to walk little by little with trembling legs. The long dress decorated with bows got in the way, so she again got tangled in the skirts and fell. The Lord smiled and asked what was wrong with her. She must go to the end. Siren tensed and began to slowly rise. Her body was shaking. She lifted the hem of her skirt and slowly walked towards Chiron. The mermaid happily said, "It worked." But the man pulled her by the hand, plopped her down on the bed and hovered over her. She had to get here. The Duke lifted her leg. He asked how long she had been walking that her legs were so warm. The girl looked at him with large, uncomprehending eyes. The Lord slightly squeezed her ankle and asked if she was tired. The water nymph blushed a little. She replied that everything was fine. His lordship, still not letting go of his leg, bowed lower and said that it was great then and asked me to sing for him. Siren looked into his eyes and did not understand. The man touched her lips with his fingers and once again asked her to sing for him right now. When Chiron was a boy, he would sit on the beach and watch the sea for hours. He listened to the sound of the surf, inhaled the aroma of the ocean, watched the ebb and flow of the tides. His mentor was worried about his student's behavior. He found him once again on the beach, and even the cold wind was not a hindrance. Duncan asked the young Duke what was bothering him, since he spent all day looking at the sea. The boy replied that the sea fascinates him, so he wants it for himself. He wants to touch him with his own hands at least once. And now, many years later, Chiron owned the sea in the form of a mermaid. He stroked her face and asked why she was silent, why she didn't sing the song. The nymph asked what the song was. His lordship was surprised. She doesn't know what it is. She didn't teach them, or she was afraid to teach, knowing that they were cursed. Everyone first promises to serve with all their hearts, swears allegiance, but in the end they cannot hide their essence forever. This mermaid is a monster. This means she can definitely kill him. My lord chuckled. It looks like the stupid people really kept her like a simple fish in an aquarium. The man said one of the names of the seas, Berses, and asked the nymph if she was familiar with this name. Siren opened her eyes and opened her mouth. Chiron just spoke their language. His lordship noticed the girl's reaction, and he guessed that the mermaids really spoke an ancient language. The nymph nodded happily in response, and Berses apparently means lullaby. The Duke lay down on the side, the bed creaking under him. He stroked the girl's cheek and asked her to sing Berses. She turned her head towards him and looked intently. The man hurried, touching her lips. The mermaid began to make melodious sounds. The Lord listened attentively. But it was not a song but a spell that awakens very old memories. It's drizzling and the wind is driving the waves crashing against the shore. The boy goes into the depths of the water. He then said that he wanted to take possession of the sea, but in fact he only wanted to fall into its arms. You can no longer feel the soil under your feet. There is a solid wall of water all around, which lulls you to sleep with its measured rocking. A small spot of light is visible through the abyss, and the depth draws you deeper into serenity. If only the guy could touch him and die without fear. If only he could die at sea. Chiron looked into the mermaid's eyes and drowned in the depths of those blue eyes. They enveloped him more and more. Now I understand why he brought her here. Lord himself argued that fairy tales are simple fables, but in fact he apparently wanted the nymph to charm and kill him. The Duke stroked the girl's face and then kissed her. Siren was stunned. She tried to find out what it was, but the man told her to continue singing Berzes. He didn't ask to stop. His lordship touched the pink hair, moving back to his lips. He whispered to her to continue until she swallowed him completely. The mermaid, blushing, continued to purr the melody. My lord began to kiss the nymph back until he was completely lost in the sensations and sounds of the melody. The next morning, the siren woke up and suddenly jumped up in bed. She looked around, trying to reconstruct the events of last night. Seeing Kieran nearby, she shuddered. That's right. They fell asleep like that yesterday. Remembering the kiss, the girl immediately flushed. She wondered what he did to her yesterday. It was something that tickled her and made her heart flutter. This means that encountering a serenade evokes such feelings. The nymph carefully extended her hand to his lips and touched them. The man woke up abruptly, so she didn't even have time to react. He immediately grabbed her throat with both hands and began to squeeze. The girl resisted and screamed. She began to choke and wheeze. Somehow the mermaid whispered, "Let go." The mermaid was almost out of breath. She grabbed the Duke's hands and tried to pull them away. She was in pain. The nymph screamed with her last strength for him to let her go. The lord flinched from her scream and seemed to wake up from a dream. He instantly unclasped his fingers. The girl coughed, trying to catch her breath. The man finally came to his senses and looked around. He saw a bright light in the window. It's strange. The sun had already risen, but he didn't dream of anything. His lordship leaned over to the Undine and asked if she was going to take his soul. If yes, then he will need it. Siren didn't understand him at all. Returning to her place, the mermaid shared her emotions with Anna. She bombarded the lady with questions. She kissed the Duke yesterday. This was a new word for the girl. The maid explained that this is when lips touch. But she asked me not to do this to other people. It's called a kiss. Kisses are very important. They are something special. And they are done only with those for whom there are feelings. The nymph touched her cheek. Feelings? She remembered how she and Kieran were lying in bed and he stroked her cheek. How he kissed her lips, her palms. This means he considers her his mate. And so my lord gave her a name, Melusine. Triton couldn't concentrate on his work. He tried to figure it out. After the death of the last emperor, he could not sleep normally even with sleeping pills for 5 years. Yang wondered if this might be the influence of the mermaid. If so, then today his lordship too. Kieran interrupted him, asking if this is exactly what he came to talk about early in the morning. At the moment, the lord is not at all aware of the affairs of the Marquis of Gesnal recently. The count quickly came to his senses and, rummaging through the papers, found the report. The Marquis doubled the number of his soldiers this year. This is when compared with the past. And by the end of this year he plans to increase their number 3 times, excluding nobles who supported the overthrow of the previous emperor. The work was mainly carried out in the imperial palace or in the capital. Almost everyone agrees and supports it. His lordship noticed that everything was worse than they thought. Ian agreed. He asked if people should be sent to the marquis. My lord shook his leg as he sat in his chair. He replied that in 2 months these people would not be needed, so we're watching for now. After a short pause, Kieran addressed his subordinate by his full name. He was a little surprised. The Duke then asked if he was sure. The Count did not understand what was going on. The Lord insisted that he understood. He asked if Ian was sure that he wanted to become a rebel with him. Triton paused for a moment and then continued speaking. It may be too late to discuss this, but you don't have to follow the plan. For supporting his plan, Ian may be in danger. Kieran asked the Count to be careful, because he was his assistant and not just a servant. The guy continued to hold a pile of documents in his hands. He turned to my lord, saying that the Duke's aspirations were his aspirations too, and he asked permission to go with him to the end. My lord chuckled, savoring the phrase, "Your aspirations are my aspirations." He thanked his subordinate for such words and released him. Ian turned to leave, but finally suggested that if necessary, he would send the mermaid again for the night. The lord's hand on the armrest trembled. Siren was really useful. His lordship lit a cigar. Blowing out puffs of smoke, the man began to think. How many times does he need to listen to her song in order to fall into eternal sleep? There was a knock on the door and a knight looked into the room. He said that the gentleman asked to bring the Undine again. The maid was just finishing the nymph's toilet, fastening a necklace around her neck. Anna was delighted. After all, she said that the master would call her again. He definitely liked the mermaid. It's good that the maid prepared her in advance. Serena was sitting in a beautiful dress with a corset. She straightened her hair and repeated the word, liked. As the knight led the girl away, the maid asked her to be careful. The warrior carefully supported the nymph, helping her walk. Anna looked after them and realized that the knight also treated her mistress with care. She spent the night with the duke and still remains in the castle. This is the first time. His lordship clearly feels something special for her. The floor creaked under the mermaid's feet as she entered my lord's chambers. The room was pitch dark. The girl looked around, trying to see at least something. She wondered where Kieran was. Suddenly, arms wrapped around her waist from behind and a male voice called her Melusine and said that he had been waiting. Siren shuddered and Triton began to examine and touch her. He noticed that today the nymph was especially elegant. The girl froze. It was unpleasant for her when he touched her there. His lordship was fiddling with the details of his clothing. The mermaid asked to wait, but the duke thought that she was uncomfortable and he decided to help her. They accidentally caught the necklace and the beads scattered on the floor. The man pressed himself against her neck from behind, inhaling the scent of her skin. He muttered something about the clumsy maid and how the nymph smelled different now. Then he invited Melusine to take off her clothes. The girl was confused. She didn't understand how to remove it or what she needed to do. Kieran's hands wandered all over her ribbons and ties. Then he realized that she didn't know how to film all this. His lordship sat down on the bed. Undine stood before him. He gently tugged at the corset band, saying that he said he didn't like pets that required too much attention. As soon as all the fasteners were conquered, the dress fell at the feet of the winner. Siren was left in only her shirt. She was a little confused and immediately blushed. My lord, looking at her, was surprised at the reaction. He asked what happened and assumed that the nymph decided to be shy. But Melusine almost jumped for joy. It's much more convenient for her. She thanked the man. Kieran smiled. She was happy because of such a little thing. If she was truly grateful, then... He grabbed her by the waist and pulled her onto his lap. The mermaid only had time to gasp. Holding the girl in his arms, Triton asked to begin her work. He asked to sing Berceuse. The mermaid smiled and the enchanting sounds of the melody flowed from her lips. The sun's rays were already breaking through the curtains into the windows. Melusine blinked her eyes, waking up. She looked at the windows and realized that it was already dawn. Then the nymph looked at the sleeping duke nearby. She likes it so much that Kieran is always around lately. But it's a little unfortunate that he didn't kiss her like last time. It was so nice. She carefully straightened his hair. Since they often spend nights together, it means she can get pregnant. Serena hoped that this would happen soon. She admired his facial features. He has incredibly beautiful eyes and nose. She gently stroked his cheekbones with her fingertips, and then lightly kissed his forehead. His lordship opened his eyes and stared at her. The girl got scared and covered her mouth with her hands. But Kieran managed to grab her hand. He looked great in the morning sun. The man smiled and teased Melusine with feigned surprise that she could do this too. My lord still held her hand with one hand and gently grabbed the back of her head with the other. He asked not to turn away. Triton covered the mermaid's lips with his own, their tongues intertwined in a kiss. His lordship pressed the siren to the bed with his body. With his left hand he lifted her thigh and pressed her even closer. But the girl coughed. She didn't have enough air. Kieran said to breathe through the nose. That's why they used to kiss only with their lips. He will show you how to do it right. She just needs to relax. And the man kissed the nymph again. During the day, Melusine walked in the garden. Anna ran back after her with her shoes. She offered her to put on her shoes. But the mermaid did not want to. She was already comfortable. It was so beautiful all around. Many flowers emitted different scents. Undine climbed into the flower bed. She was delighted that the flowers had opened up more than they had on the previous walk. The nymph examined each flower. This yellow one is called freesia. There was a blue butterfly sitting on the marigolds. Siren did not know the name of such a flower. The moth flapped its wings and took off. The girl followed him and saw the duke approaching. He extended his hand and a butterfly landed on his finger. Melusine was surprised. This flower is moving. She asked what it was called. Kieran replied that it is not a flower, it is a butterfly. The insect flapped its wings and flew away. The mermaid repeated the word butterfly. My lord praised her and said that in her language it is called efshaik. The girl sat down on the path and watched the flying moth. Triton stood nearby. Then the nymph looked back at the man. The wind blew her hair. She called the Lord by name. He praised her for remembering his name and flicked her forehead. Siren yelped. Kieran said her pronunciation was terrible and she needed to try to pronounce it better. She replied that she would try. The Duke turned around and moved towards the exit. On the way, he said that he would call the maid. When Melusine has had enough of the flowers, let her return to the house. As soon as the mermaid realized that he was leaving, she jumped up sharply and said the word together. Then, after thinking, she added that she wanted to go together. His lordship looked at her and answered, "As you wish." The girl beamed with joy and rushed to catch up with the man. Triton headed towards the training yard, where the warm-up was in full swing, and the clanging of steel could be heard. The nymph was amazed by what she saw. Anna caught up with her near the gate. She asked why Serena followed the master all the way to the training ground. If his lordship had not closed his eyes to this, they would have been kicked out long ago. Melusine watched in fascination as the knights practiced with swords. The maid once again asked her mistress if she could hear her. "It's dangerous here and they could get hurt if they're not careful." But then the mermaid saw the Duke riding a beautiful black horse. She beamed and pointed it out to the maid. The girl said it was Chiron. Anna said that the Duke really makes an incredible impression. Her father was also a knight at Triton Castle, and he said that only his grace among all the commanders trained every day. My lord pulled the reins, praised the warriors, and said that was all for today. The maid continued that if father had not died in battle, he would also be here. But the mermaid no longer listened to her. She ran to the Duke with the words, "Kieran, I'm coming!" The maid shouted after her that she couldn't constantly run after his lordship. However, Melusine replied that she did as she wanted. Siren spied from behind the slightly open doors as my lord and the count dined in the dining room. Anna tried to pull the mistress down and insisted on returning to the room. Because if they are noticed, then there will be trouble. The dining room was large and bright. In the center, on a large carpet, was an impressive dining table. It was filled with many dishes. The servants stood a little further away, near the door, ready to serve the owners at any moment. The men at the table were talking peacefully. Melusine did not let up. She wondered why they couldn't be here. The maid began to explain in a whisper that the gentlemen were having dinner, and they should not interfere with the conversation of nobles who are discussing pressing matters. The mermaid was delighted at the word food. Anna was already on the verge of a nervous breakdown. She replied that men don't just eat. Then the door opened slightly from the inside and a footman looked out. The girls fell in surprise. He wondered what was going on here. The maid began to apologize and promised that they would leave immediately. The guy thought about it. Everything is fine. His lordship just said that it was better not to distract him like that. More precisely, just enter, and not stand here. These words were like green light for the nymph. Her eyes sparkled with delight and she headed straight to the dining room. The Duke had just sipped a glass of wine. Melusine was seated at the table. She was intently trying to cut the cooked fish, clanging her cutlery against the porcelain. His lordship continued his conversation with Ian. He asked how much they spent this time. The count replied that about 60 million fears. My lord remarked that he had only heard a few days ago that the emperor had acquired a diamond mine. His Excellency asked why he was buying them if he did not think of mining stones. Probably Marquis Hesnal is pushing him to this. Siren puffed intently over the fish. Kieran took a sip of wine and replied that the old man was in a hurry, since he was trying to squeeze every penny out of the imperial treasury. Then he asked whether Syrtis Castle had been completed and received the answer that this year. This time the mermaid creaked her instruments too loudly and drew attention to herself. She cringed a little, realizing that she had made a mistake. The castle will be finally ready at the beginning of this winter. Now the interior decoration is underway. There are now many dissatisfied people among the aristocrats, since all efforts are aimed at preparing for the founding day of the country. The Lord asked how the Marquis would now commit outrages if he got rid of the control of the former emperor. This is a great time to be the Marquis of Hesnal. Yang agreed, but precisely because of this, some middle-ranking aristocrats also decided to support Triton. At that moment, the girl overdid it, and due to the strong pressure, pieces of fish scattered in all directions. Kieran couldn't resist and tricked Melusine with the fact that she was asking to have a meal with them, but didn't know how to behave at the table. The nymph froze with a fork in her hand, looking with huge eyes. Then his lordship asked the servants to serve the mermaid's usual food. Immediately they brought 2 raw fish in a plate. The girl continued to twirl the fork and knife in her hands. Seeing that she was hesitating, the Lord asked that perhaps she did not want to eat today. Siren, pointing to the cutlery, asked Kieran what it was. Ian choked on his drink at such familiarity. He coughed and asked if she had really called my lord by name. But the Duke made a remark to Melusine on another matter. She mispronounced his name. You need to focus on the first part of the name and pronounce the second more softly. The mermaid tried to pronounce it correctly. Lord said more practice is needed. And if using a fork is inconvenient, then you can eat as best you can. But don't just sit there. The nymph was delighted, wished herself a bon appetit, grabbed the fish with both hands and sank her teeth into it. His lordship and the servants were shocked by this way of eating food, and the girl enjoyed the process, deliciously crunching fish bones. Triton noticed that she had a good appetite and asked if it tasted good to her. The mermaid beamed with joy. She replied that it was very tasty and thanked the man. The Duke carefully removed the excess from around her mouth. Ian, still confused by what he had seen, turned to my lord. His Excellency asked to continue telling how many noble houses there support their endeavors. His lordship began to answer, and he himself was surprised at what he saw. A mermaid sat in front of him with a live nibbled fish in her hands and smiled sweetly at the Duke, and he, in turn, carefully wiped her face. The night's training was in full swing. The warriors were practicing techniques on dummies, so there was noise around and dull blows could be heard. Melusine watched the process with interest from behind the slightly open gate. The Duke was drying himself after exercise. Ian stood nearby. Seeing the mermaid peeking out, he noticed that His Excellency had even brought her here. Kieran didn't understand and asked who. The Count pointed to the girl. Lately, she's been following the Lord's ponytail. I even came to training. Kieran was surprised what was wrong. He is amused by the nymph's confidence in not being noticed. It now became clear to his lordship why the commander was in such a good mood. Triton said that he was interested in watching how the wild creature was gradually tamed. Young asked if my lord had tamed animals before. The Duke thought about it. He remembered the pet fox he had more than 10 years ago. Then the mentor noticed that he was constantly following the teenager and rubbing himself against his legs. Usually wild foxes are afraid of people. The boy could not do anything. The animal itself followed him. Duncan teased the child, reminding him who lets the animal into his room every night. The little fox was affectionate and calmly walked into his arms. He could even lick his owner's hands. The mentor suggested giving the animal a name if the young master wanted to keep it, so that he doesn't get lost. One day, Kieran tried to lock the little fox in the room, because his brother is coming soon and wants to hunt in the grounds. Therefore, he tried to explain to the animal that he could not leave the room. The fox purred and closed his eyes when he scratched him, but the little fox is just an animal. He somehow got out of the room and accordingly came under attack. Sometime later, the boy found his wounded body in the forest. Waking up from his memories, Triton replied that he had already tamed the beast. In his opinion, when you catch an animal, you need to immediately put it in a good cage and keep it there until it realizes it can never get out, even if he dies. The Duke looked at the mermaid, who was chatting about something with her maid under the gate. Late in the evening, when the moon was already illuminating everything around, His Excellency brought Melusine to the beach. The wind played in my hair, and the waves of the surf licked the sand under my feet. The mermaid was delighted. She exclaimed, "See, see." Kieran asked if she liked it and allowed her to come closer. The girl looked at him questioningly and asked what about him. The man replied that he would remain on the shore. He needs to check something. Serena came almost to the water itself. She looked back at my lord and asked what to check. The Duke remembered his first pet. The wounded little ladder lay in the forest on the grass and wheezed. The boy was sad. He asked the shuddering little body why he was here. After all, his lordship asked to sit in the room repeated 1,000 times. There was a noise and dull thuds nearby. Someone shouted that the beast had gone here. Kieran froze. He understood that now his brother would come here and catch the little fox, and then mercilessly kill him. The animal was bleeding and trembling in convulsions. Tears welled up in the child's eyes. It would be better if he did it himself. The boy took out a dagger. Tears blurred his eyes. But it must be strong to ease the pet's suffering. Gathering his courage, he plunged the blade into his friend. The wind blew through Melusine's hair as she approached the water. The water was already touching her feet. Ian began to worry that the mermaid was about to swim out to sea. but my lord stopped him with his hand, ordering him to wait. He wanted to see if she would float away or stay. The girl was already knee-deep in the water. A pattern of scales began to appear on the skin of my legs. She was enjoying the moment. Serena hasn't been at sea for so long. The Count was already nervously biting his nails. He assumed that the nymph's tail would grow back in the water. The Duke called the girl. She looked back. She was so pleased to be in seawater. The mermaid asked if she could go further. It's no big deal. But the Lord shouted for her to return immediately. Melusine laughed and said she would be there soon. Kieran said that she could come closer. And she, waving her tail, dived into the depths, raising a column of spray. His lordship commented that she had disappeared. Triton got angry. How dare she? Nodules appeared on his cheekbones and he threw himself into the water. Duncan's words pulsed in his head. If you want to keep the animal, give it a name so it doesn't get lost. No. You cannot restrain the beast with just the name. The little fox then had to be tied so that he would not fall into a trap. The man was afraid that if he let Melusine go, someone might take her from him. But she was already emerging from the water, wringing out her hair. Water flowed down her legs. Undine saw the Duke running and called out to him. Kieran pulled the girl by the hand, pulled her close and kissed her. She tried to say something, but the man's tongue completely drowned out the words. His lordship drew his dagger with his other hand, and grabbing the mermaid by the hair from behind, he put a blade to her throat. He was interested in how much she missed the sea. So much so that I wanted to run away. Serena was scared. She didn't want to run away, but I just wanted to swim. His lordship asked why he should believe her. Animals are not allowed to walk without a leash. He lowered the dagger to his hand, still painfully pulling her hair. Triton chuckled and said that it was his own fault for believing her. The girl was stunned by the man's strange behavior. Then my lord sharply turned the nymph to face the water and told her to look carefully at the sea, because the Undine would not see it again. Melusine asked why, but his lordship, grabbing the mermaid by the hand, dragged her from the beach. Ian hurried after the couple, addressing the lord. The Duke stopped and ordered the Count to return to the castle and tell the servants that he would not spend the night at home, but in the nearest lodge. Kieran brought the mermaid to a small house not far from the shore. He pulled her by the hand and the girl asked to let her go, but he didn't listen to her until he threw her on the bed. She was in pain. My lord unbuttoned the cuffs and shirt on his chest. Then, pressing the bed with his knees, he began to approach the siren. Partially pinning the girl to the bed, Triton hovered over her. He asked the nymph what he should do with her. Melusine looked at him in surprise and fear with wide eyes, practically without blinking. The man touched her face. The mermaid shuddered. Even if he puts her on a leash, the Undine will quickly free herself, and it won't be interesting to play with her. The lord addressed her by name. It was he who gave the siren a name, so she must obey him. My lord lifted her face by the chin and touched her lips with his thumb. The girl tried to repeat the word, obey. Kieran pressed his tongue with his finger in her mouth. He ordered, looking into blue eyes, to say that she obeys him, that she is his, that she belongs to him, and that she will follow him through fire and water. Melusine asked what she told him. Then she tried to say that she belonged to him. His lordship chuckled contentedly. Then he lifted her face by the chin towards his. The nymph instantly blushed. The Duke began to kiss her, and in between kisses he told her not to act so stupidly again. The caresses became more passionate, and the man laid the mermaid on the bed, completely crushing her under him. In the process, my lord inserted his fingers into her mouth, expecting caresses, but the girl did not know what to do, so she pushed them out, coughing. He commented that he needed to get her ready and she was already spitting it out. Then his hand began to move up her thigh. Melusine was frightened by such intimate touches and began to resist. She asked to stop. His lordship reduced the pressure a little. He asked her to relax and began to gently kiss her neck. Serena thought about how she felt so strange. After his actions, the nymph began to tremble all over. It wasn't like last time. Then they just lay together, but now they could conceive a child. When it was all over, the Undine clarified whether this was the end. Triton answered in the negative, and he assured her that the night would be long. He smiled and stroked his face with her hand. Moonlight penetrated through the window frames and illuminated the lovers on the bed. His lordship taught Melusine the art of love. He explained to her that there was no need to bite fingers, but that they should be licked. The mermaid tried to understand the new sensations for her. There was something wrong in the pit of my stomach, but she was so pleased that she could not restrain herself. She unknowingly bit my lord's finger. Kieran gritted his teeth and growled that he was asking him to relax. But the groans drowned out all the words. This was the first time Siren felt like this. It was a strange and incomprehensible feeling. But it was still nice. She wanted to see the man's face. She pulled back a little and looked her partner in the eyes. Then she kissed her with all her passion. His lordship continued until both had enjoyed themselves. The sun's rays illuminated Triton's castle, standing on a stone cliff. The surf broke the waves against the rocks. The sunbeams made their way through the window panes and played indoors. Melusine woke up and blinked, squinting her eyes against the shining sun. She saw an excited Anna opposite. The maid turned to her and asked if she had come to her senses. The nymph rose up in bed and sat up. She didn't understand what was happening. The maid was glad that her mistress had woken up. It turns out the siren slept for 2 days. Therefore, the worker could not find a place for herself from excitement. She checked the temperature of the mistress's forehead, and taking her face in her hands asked if she was feeling well. The mermaid replied that it was good, but asked where they were. Anna moved back a little and pointed out that this was the hostess's room. Melusine turned sharply and asked where Kieran was. The maid hesitated. She lowered her eyes and replied that his lordship was not here. He was meeting a guest. The nymph asked what kind of guest she was. The maid said that the daughter of the Marquis of Hesnal was coming to the castle, who would become the bride of the Archduke. A carriage drawn by a pair of bay horses had just pulled into the guest yard, and out came a beautiful young girl in a red velvet dress with long blonde hair. A little later, the mermaid was sitting in the pool while the maid was combing her hair. They talked about the institution of marriage. Melusine clarified, "That means 1 man and 1 woman." The maid confirmed that only 2 people get married. They swear to God that they will spend their whole lives with each other. And before that, they enter into an engagement. The nymph noticed that Kieran spent the night with both her and that beautiful woman. Anna replied that it was different from marriage. His lordship is not engaged, so in theory he can afford this. And frankly, he is a blood relative of the ruling dynasty and therefore is free to do whatever he wants. Siren doubted. In her understanding, the more children, the better. The maid was surprised where she could have heard such a thing. Having finished combing her hair, the maid put all the accessories in a basket. And then she warned that she wouldn't be there after lunch. The nymph asked why. And she received the answer that the head maid had given instructions to everyone, and Anna would need to go to the city center. Melusine asked what the center was. The maid explained that this place was outside the castle walls. There are a lot of people there who are selling something, especially now since Thanksgiving is just around the corner. At this time, the largest festival takes place in the empire. There will be performances and all sorts of souvenirs. The mermaid was delighted and also wanted to go. But the worker said that she couldn't do it because she needed a good rest today. But the girl didn't let up. She didn't understand why she couldn't. Anna took a deep breath and then exhaled to hide her irritation. She can't do anything if she can't. After lunch, the city center was full of people. The area was filled with counters with awnings, on which a variety of goods were located. People moved from one outlet to another. In one of the carriages were 2 maids and Melusina. The head maid in a whisper clarified with Anna that they could really go out with the mermaid. At this time, the nymph leaned out of the carriage window and looked at everything with delight. The maid answered in a whisper that Count Luthern had given permission, since she was so eager. Since the siren doesn't travel very well yet, it won't go far. And anyway, thanks to the lady mermaid, they are traveling in a carriage. Ondine was spinning in all directions. She was interested in everything. She constantly asked Anna something. Seeing the chicken, the nymph asked what kind of red algae was on her head. Other birds have feathers, and the bald man glistens in the sun like an octopus. The maids were tired of answering constant questions, so they ordered the siren to climb back into the cart. When we arrived at the place, all the women got out of the carriage. The maid said that she would quickly go to a shop and asked her to wait here next to the knight. The mermaid nodded. The maids asked the warrior to look after the girl, but Melusine could not be kept in place. There were so many interesting things around that were not in the castle. There were so many smells and sounds in Kieran's world. She was delighted. Suddenly a melody poured out from somewhere. The nymph shuddered. This song seemed familiar to her. The knight caught up with the lady and said that she should not run around here alone. But she answered that now, quickly turned around and disappeared into the crowd. It was definitely her sister's song. and the Undine followed the sound of the melody. The warrior tried to stop the mermaid, but there was already no trace of her. Melusine squeezed through the crowd of people. All she could think about was that her sister was here. Soon she saw a begging old woman in rags, who clung to passers-by with the words that she was dying. People avoided her, considering her to be somehow contagious. The beggar woman sat dejectedly on the ground and repeated that he should give her serenade. The mermaid approached this woman and spoke in their language. She asked what was wrong with her. Maybe she was sick. The grandmother immediately rushed to the siren and grabbed her hands. Melusine clarified that maybe she was just hungry. The woman nodded that yes, she was hungry. She said she was dying of hunger. And then she asked if she was her sister and asked for help. The mermaid began to look around. Here the knight found her. He asked to return to the carriage because she could get into trouble. But the nymph rushed to the fish counter and asked to take some for her sister. The guy didn't understand anything. What kind of sister? Why does she need fish? However, the siren did not wait. She grabbed the fish and ran back. Melusine ran down the street so fast that the horse reared. The coachman began to vouch and called her crazy. The knight made his way through the crowd in search of the lady. She had already given the fish to her sister and watched as she ate greedily. The nymph looked back to the warrior asking him to wait and wanted to ask for more, since the sister was hungry. But it turned out to be the coachman from that carriage. He started swearing and shouting that she didn't understand who was rushing under the carriage and even swung at her. But the approaching lord shouted at him to remove his hand. The coachman was surprised and froze. My lord came closer and asked if he was deaf, and then he ordered to quickly remove his hand. It was Duke Triton. The charioteer, calling out "Your Grace," fell to his knees and bowed. He asked for forgiveness and mercy. Melusine jumped up joyfully and threw herself on the lord's neck, shouting his name. The girl pressed herself against his chest and said that she really missed him. But the man did not react at all. Then the mermaid pulled back a little and looked at him questioningly. Suddenly, from a nearby carriage, an appeal was heard to my lord. A blonde in a red dress came out of the carriage. She called back, asking if it was really him. The duke waved at the siren and turned around to address Lady Hesnall. The girl curtsied and noted that they had not seen each other for a long time. She apologized for the commotion. Kieran approached the lady and replied that it was his fault too. Milady was very good-natured. She praised her interlocutor, saying that he was so noble, a true hero of the Empire. She also added that they are talking about another of his feats. His lordship noticed that the Marquis said that the lady would visit him next week. The blonde asked if she was in a hurry. She was curious about what Triton's castle was like. I wanted to see him as soon as possible. After all, this place will become her home. The lady hoped she wouldn't cause any inconvenience. Melusine looked out from behind Kieran with interest. He replied that he would not deliver and volunteered to escort the lady. The girl smiled sweetly, fanning herself. She was glad to be invited by his lordship. And of course he will not refuse such an honor. Just what kind of lady is this? And pointed to the siren. She asked her to introduce. The nymph shuddered. But the duke replied that this was not necessary. After all, raising pets is very difficult. The blonde understood what he meant. After all, the more beautiful the animal, the more difficult it is to look after it. And the couple headed to the carriage. Undine extended her hand and called to Kieran. Without turning around, he told her to behave decently. Then they got into the carriage and left. Melusine was left alone and looked after him with an unblinking gaze. He had such a strange look when he left. When she remembered this, something stabbed so painfully in her chest. She stood motionless in the center of the square, pressing her hand to her heart. The beggar woman giggled behind her. Grabbing the girl's hand, the old woman said with a toothless mouth that when the time comes, she will have to choose the sea. Squeezing her wrist harder, she continued that no matter what happens, if she starts thinking, it will be too late. It's too late. The mermaid sat thoughtfully on the bed in her room, supporting her head. Anna asked her if the lady would leave the room today. The weather is so wonderful outside. But Melusine was sad because Kieran didn't come today again. The maid came up, put her arm around the girl's shoulders and replied that his lordship was very busy. When he finishes his business, he will definitely find the siren. Undine asked if she could go to him and see the Duke herself. The maid quickly raised her hands in protest and said that this was definitely not possible. You just need to wait and the gentleman himself will come to her. You need to be patient a little. The nymph looked sadly at the servants. Anna suggested taking a walk in the garden to dispel the sadness. The mermaid turned to the window and noticed that new roses had been planted there. The maid was delighted and said that she would definitely feel better when the mistress saw them. Melusine walked dejectedly in the front garden between the bushes of beautiful roses and other flowers. She thought sadly that the maid was a liar, since there was nothing fun in the garden. Last time she was here with his lordship. Siren was completely lost in her thoughts, not noticing anything around her. Suddenly, a female voice asked for the opportunity to pass. The nymph looked up and saw Lady Hesnal in front of her. The blonde was walking with her maid. The girl, fanning herself, said that she did not want to interfere. Then, looking at Melusine, she exclaimed that she knew her. And then she asked if the Undine remembered her. The lady smiled and said she was glad to meet again. She tried to remember her name. The mermaid said her name. The girl remembered and replied that it was a beautiful and unusual name. Then, addressing the siren as if she were a lady, she suggested they take a little walk together. And the girls walked at a leisurely pace along the paths with flowers. Milady noticed that their last meeting did not happen under the best circumstances. Therefore, they could not get to know each other as they should. Then she asked what family the nymph was from, or rather what country. Melusine thought that this lady spoke so difficultly that she should have come here with Anna. She sounds like she's asking where she's from. Hesnal continued to mutter the names of the kingdoms. The mermaid replied that she was from Bercez. The lady asked again. Siren confirmed that yes, Bercez, the sea. Milady covered herself with her fan and thought, "It's strange, as far as she knows, there is no country there. True, there are legends that mermaids live near some islands." The lady asked in surprise that she really was the fairy tale mermaid. Ondine laughed and confirmed. Suddenly the maid barked that this was all nonsense, and the girl clearly has problems with her head, since she is talking such nonsense. The lady asked her to calm down because it was interesting. She began to examine her interlocutor more closely. Unusual colored hair, bare feet. His lordship said that he was raising a little animal. The lady slammed her fan. This is good. Now she doesn't have to worry. In her own way, she raised the nymph's chin with a fan. Usually my lord was not interested in anything, but if she was a mermaid, then everything would be different. Anyone would happily lay their hands on such a treasure. After playing with the siren's hair with a fan, her ladyship turned around and walked away, pondering the information. She didn't think the duke was so humane. The lady is even glad that she discovered his other side. Melusina followed up by asking the girl's name. She looked back and called herself Estelle Hesnal, daughter of the Marquis and his lordship's fiancé. And this is the last time the mermaid is allowed to speak to her on a first-name basis. Ondine stood confused, trying to pronounce her name and bride. She couldn't understand everything the lady was saying, but... Siren asked the girl if she also spent the night with Chiron. The blonde twitched. She looked angrily at the nymph and told her not to make her angry. The lady approached her and hit her on the chest with a fan, asking what kind of question it was. Did this one really think that the world had fallen at her feet, since she caught his lordship's eye and found herself in his arms? Then she hovered over the unfortunate woman and angrily asked if she managed to get pregnant. The maid called out to the mistress. The mermaid touched her belly and thought, "Child." She replied that not yet, but soon. Estelle huffed, "Soon." Then she warned Melusine not to even dream of such a thing. Then she added that she even felt sorry for the Undine. If she gets pregnant, she will definitely die. The siren flushed all over at this word. The lady added that the mermaid didn't understand why she turned a blind eye to her antics. For the aristocrats of the empire, relationships on the side are not such a big problem. The main thing is not to break continuity. In their country, children born out of wedlock are treated worse than criminals. And in general, why did she decide that the duke would be delighted with the nymph's offspring? Lady Hesnal grimaced angrily. The archduke, who has already suffered due to rumors that he is the illegitimate son of the former emperor, will not be happy with the bastard. The lady began to painfully poke Melusine with a folded fan. At the same time, she asked why the siren surrendered to him. Approaching the mermaid, the lady angrily hissed that even if she gave birth, my lord would personally finish off both her and her foundling. Then she turned around sharply and added that Melusine could continue to live in dreams. And as she left, she thanked her for the walk. The girl remained standing with her mouth open, digesting what was said. Late in the evening, Marquis Hesnal and Chiron were drinking in the library. His lordship heard that the duke met Estelle outside the castle. She left home so quickly and immediately went to meet his lordship. The gray-haired guest laughed. Perhaps my lord was surprised, but he hopes for an understanding of the situation. Triton took a sip of his drink and replied that it didn't bother him, so he didn't have to apologize. The man chuckled and noticed that my lord was still cold. The lord smiled and asked if this was really so. The Marquis came to discuss something, since he addressed him before the reception. His Excellency looked seriously at the young man. He wanted to know how serious he was about taking the throne. Perhaps a suitable day and time has already been determined. The Duke relaxed in his chair. He was also going to ask the question about whether there was any reason to rush. Because lately the Marquis has been acting almost openly. The gray-haired man laughed. He replied that a new castle would be built in the winter, certes, and called on his lordship to think about it. The old emperor will give up the castle he spent so long building. The Marquis leaned over a little and, waving his hand, added that the new ruler would begin a new era. After all, it will be symbolic and amazing. Kieran tensed a little. He asked if this meant that upon completion of the construction of the castle, Hesnal wanted to kill the emperor and seize the throne. The guest replied that most of the nobles were already on his side anyway. Triton leaned over a little and noticed that unrest was raging in the country, and the emperor was only busy with construction. If they take advantage of the situation, the empress will give birth in the spring, and if they make a mistake, it will lead not only to disagreements, but also to claims from neighboring countries. The Marquis scratched his head and agreed with His Excellency. But they have been preparing for this for a very long time, and he worries that the enemy might find out about their plans. After all, the aristocrats have long been dissatisfied with the emperor. The Duke tilted his head slightly and answered doubtfully that they were unlikely to be indignant. Perhaps it's just Hesnal who wants to get everything over with before his daughter's wedding. The man shuddered. If the Marquis immediately places Triton on the throne, then his daughter, upon marriage, will receive the status of empress. The guest protested. Kieran bowed his head, holding a glass of drink. He decided to tone down the pressure a little, turning everything into a joke, citing the fact that they had not seen each other for a long time. My lord shared his lordship's fears and proposed to decide on the exact day. The Marquis thanked him and added that he sided with the Duke not only to make his daughter an empress. He always served only his lordship. Kieran took a sip. He was pleased with the gray-haired man's words. After talking with Triton, His Excellency left the library. His colleague was waiting for him outside the door. He asked how everything went, whether the Duke was still against it. The men continued down the corridor. Hesnal exhaled and replied that it was possible. The interlocutor objected that it was his lordship who delayed the implementation of the plan for so long. The Marquis said not to worry. Only Kieran hates their ruler more. After all, the emperor had already sent him to war so many times. Therefore, he is not eager to obey orders if he has the opportunity to seize the throne for himself. That is why the lord accepted the engagement to Estelle. And most importantly, the Archduke's hatred for the current and past monarch is incredibly great. Therefore, there is no need to worry. He definitely won't betray them. Triton remained in the library. His thoughts flashed back to a decade ago. The then emperor stood with a whip over young Kieran. The boy was trembling all over. Tears flowed from his eyes. He begged his brother to stop. But the bishop said that his heart bleeds from how naive his younger brother is. Is the guy really that worried that he gave the order to kill his mentor? He was advancing on the child again. His Majesty asked Kieran if he still grieved for the traitor. The boy did not stop shaking and turning to his brother. The emperor said that the Marquis Hesnal sang to him that after the murder of Duncan, the guy was tormented by nightmares, and he doesn't want to fight anymore. The boy, in a friendly conversation just now, shared his experiences with His Excellency. His Majesty raised his whip. The future Archduke cannot afford such nonsense. Therefore, today he will correct the boy's weakness. The Emperor asked the Marquis to close the door on the other side. His Excellency obeyed. The child watched with tears in his eyes as the door of salvation slowly closed with a creak. As soon as the lock clicked, the first blow sounded immediately. The Duke opened his eyes and smiled doubtfully, so that a person like the Marquis would always serve only him. Count Luther interrupted his lordship's thoughts. Looking into the library, he asked if the Duke was free. After asking what happened, Ian reported that the servants had seen Lady Hesnal and the mermaid in the garden this afternoon. Kieran became wary. He said that back from the market he didn't like the lady's behavior. Apparently she decided to talk to Melusine personally. His Excellency apologized for allowing the siren to go out. He inquired about the best way to keep a nymph in her room. Kiran thought about it. Estelle is not stupid. Now she is calculating whether the mermaid can threaten her position. Therefore, it is stupid to intervene and stand up for her. This means we need to continue to observe. When she realizes that my lord is not so interested in the Undine, and when she understands the lord's sincere intentions, she will leave herself behind. The lady's maids were combing the lady's hair in her room. Anna arrived in the chambers. Estelle was glad that she had finally come. She asked the maid if she was Lady Melusine's maid. The worker was excited and trembling a little. She asked why she was called. The lady smiled and said that there is no need to worry so much. She would like to make friends with the mermaid. There's a masquerade ball coming up soon, and her ladyship would like to see her there. She then asked if the maid could bring her. Anna replied that the mistress does not yet control her body so well. Then she quickly covered her mouth, realizing that she had said too much. Something told her that showing this lady the siren was not the best decision, and Count Luthern said not to make any decisions about the lady without the direct participation of his lordship. She understood that the mermaid was important to the Duke and the maid could not just leave her. Lady Hesnall touched her chin thoughtfully. So it's impossible. Anna replied that yes and asked for forgiveness. Madame chuckled. Immediately the lady's two maids grabbed the maid by the arms and forced her to her knees. Estelle loomed over the poor girl. She asked why she thought it was a request. It was an order. Anna was shaking all over. Then the lady smiled sweetly and suggested starting the conversation again. The door to the mermaid's room swung open, and Lady Hesnall's maid entered. She reported that her mistress had ordered Lady Melusine to be taken away. And then she asked if the nymph was ready. Siren asked about the lady. The maid confirmed and added that she ordered the mermaid to be brought as soon as possible. Seeing the girl's bare feet, the maid said that even though it was summer, it was cold at night, so she needed to put on shoes. Anna rushed to put on her mistress's shoes. Melusine was against it. She didn't like shoes. The maid looked up at the Undine and asked her to be patient today, since she might see his lordship at the ball. And then she added in a whisper that the siren would ask him for help if she met him there. A strange maid quickly dragged the mermaid by the hand along the corridor. The girl did not have time and asked to wait. Then the maid took out a mask and said that she needed to put it on. Melusine obediently tied the ribbons. She didn't understand what was happening, but I hoped that if I met Kiran, everything would become clear. The door to the ballroom opened and the siren froze in admiration. The room was simply huge with many balconies. A large crystal chandelier with hundreds of candles hung from a very high ceiling, and in the center of the hall there was a beautiful fountain. The nymph wondered why this place was so strange. While she was looking at everything, two men, also wearing masks, approached her. One of them said hello and asked if she was lost. Melusine hesitated a little, but then said that she was looking for Kiran, and then she asked if they knew where he was. One man asked if the lady meant the Duke, and the other one quietly said that he had already seen this pink hair somewhere, and then he assumed that this was the girl who was with the lord in the city. Gradually, other guests began to approach them. People started talking. Suddenly, one lady loudly exclaimed who it was, and then she added that she was wearing the mask of a cheap dancer. They say she entered the castle with his lordship. The mermaid looked at the crowd in horror. Then that lady added more fuel to the fire by saying that maybe my lord decided to brighten up the evening by sending a dancer to the ball. The people started laughing. People discussed this situation with understanding, because they expected some kind of fun from the Duke. Someone grabbed the siren by the hair and asked where my lord found such a rare bird with pink hair. Others began to encourage the girl to dance, since a dancer cannot be left idle. Suddenly, someone grabbed the Undine by the shoulder from behind. It was Lady Hesnall. She said she was glad to meet again. Melusine recognized her. The lady began to whisper in her ear that she didn't seem to fully understand her place yet. The mermaid sees what these people want from her, the same as his lordship. Serena denied and said that Kiran is not like that. The lady gradually led the girl to the pool, holding her by the shoulders. With the words, "No one will help you," she pushed the nymph into the pool. But at the very last moment, men's hands managed to catch Melusine. She looked back in fear at the masked gentleman and asked who it was. Having looked closely, the mermaid recognized the Duke in the man. She was delighted and called him by name. But his lordship suddenly grabbed the girl by the hand and pulled her towards the exit. The crowd began to gossip. Someone shouted, "Where are you going?" Others tried to understand what was happening. Others recognized Triton in the man. Lady Hesnel and her companion also watched what was happening. My lord brought Melusine into the garden. Kieran asked why she always has her own way, because he told her to sit quietly. The girl lowered her head. She quietly replied that she wanted to see him. That's why the siren came. The man reached for her mask. He asked why she was walking around in such an outfit. Is it really just to see him? Kieran removed the unnecessary accessory. The lord asked if she wanted him to treat her like the women wearing such masks. Without waiting for an answer, he kissed the nymph, inciting passion and holding her tighter to him. It was nice. His lordship moved lower and began to kiss his neck. Then he paused and addressed her. The girl shuddered. He said this was her last chance. It's enough to be reckless. And he told me to return home. Triton had already turned around and wanted to leave, but the mermaid grabbed him by the sleeve. He looked back. Melusine said that she wanted to see him and asked if he would come to her room today. She looked at him with huge pleading eyes. And then she asked if he was interested in her. The man carefully touched her face and said that it seemed like she had come up with something for herself. In fact, she means nothing to him. There is nothing between them. If the siren started to have any feelings for him, then she should stop. It's just her imagination. And he walked away. The mermaid was left standing alone in the garden, but not for long. Soon Estelle approached her. She ironically noted that the girl had made such a noise in the castle, and now she was standing here. The lady took off her mask and thoughtfully continued that his lordship did not have the patience, and he brought her here to the garden of the old palace. You can understand him. She grinned and continued that Lady Melusine should have been more careful at the first ball. For example, to your mask. Only dancers wear these, so people treated her that way. Her ladyship asked if my lord had asked where the siren got such a mask. Perhaps he already considers the girl insignificant. The nymph looked back and asked why she didn't like her. Milady smiled and replied that this was not entirely true, but she likes it better when people know their place. Then she asked the mermaid if she still wanted to get pregnant from Kieran. Undine involuntarily touched her stomach. Yes, she wants a child. Estelle's gaze became prickly. She replied that this was impossible. For him, Melusine is just a toy that can be played with without consequences. The lady approached the girl, touched her lock of hair and said that he was caring for the siren and did not want anyone else to play with her. But nothing more. No one keeps toys for the rest of their lives. Then she turned around and began to move towards the exit, finally adding that when she gets tired of her, he will either throw her away or even kill her. She stopped and looked back and asked why the Undine thought why my lord left her here alone. Because he threw it away. Melusine stood completely dumbfounded. The only thought that was spinning in her head was that she had been abandoned. Then she remembered Kieran's words that these feelings were just her imagination. The mermaid walked through the garden. She remembered another of the Duke's words. He told her to stop getting on her nerves. Siren wondered if she was really tired and Kieran threw her away. The nymph knows what it means to throw. Mermaids who were unable to give birth to a child are also considered abandoned. This is the end. There is no going back. She gradually reached the sea and sat down on the shore. Melusine wondered if this meant the end between her and Kieran. She remembered his image. Did it really end like this? Triton walked through the courtyard to an observation deck overlooking the bay. Before his eyes was the image of a mermaid, her look when she said that she just wanted to see him. The lord looked sadly into the distance. Suddenly he heard Estelle's voice from behind. She asked why he was standing here alone. The Duke looked around. The girl smiled sweetly and asked what he had lost, because she didn't find anything here. Kieran thanked him for his concern, turning his head slightly. But her ladyship was not appeased. She asked to give her a dance. They say that the last couple to dance at Thanksgiving will live happily ever after. They will go hand in hand all their lives. After all, his lordship will agree to dance. The man turned and asked why. After all, she doesn't need it. The lady didn't understand what he was talking about. But I wanted to say one thing. You don't have to pay attention to flying insects. But if it is a poisonous bug, then a smart person will make medicine out of it. Because it was my lord who gave the knife to the doll that was about to be thrown away. Estelle waved her fan and extended her hand to dance. Triton turned around. He apologized and said that it seemed he had left something in the garden after all. And leaving my lady alone, he went away. The lady froze for a few seconds, and then clenched her fist out of anger and trembling. The wind played with Melusine's hair. The waves measuredly licked the sand of the shore. The girl recalled the stories of her sisters. They said it was not easy to get pregnant. It very rarely succeeds the first time. Therefore, if the mermaid's life is in danger and she cannot complete her goal, then she can always return. She must not forget that the most important thing is the child. Estelle said Kieran would kill the baby if the siren got pregnant, and even if she gives birth, he will personally finish off both her and the foundling. The nymph adjusted her cape. She decided that she needed to find another serenade, at least for the sake of the child. Ondine approached the water. She decided to return to her sisters. If they ask her where she has been, she will say that people caught her and held her. And the nymph will also tell about Kieran. She thought he was her serenade, but it was just an obsession. And she was wrong. Melusine began to go into the water but heard a strange sound. She looked around and was immediately grabbed by the hand. It was Triton. He pulled her towards him and angrily asked her since when did this place become her room. The girl asked to stop. He held her hand painfully. His eyes sparkled. After all, he told her to stop doing whatever she wanted, and also that this is her last chance. The Duke grabbed her by the waist with one hand and threw her onto the horse. The animal began to move. The mermaid got scared and asked to stop, but the man covered her mouth with his hand and ordered her to be silent. The horse rushed. His lordship tightly pressed the nymph to him. It was hard for her to breathe. She turned to him and asked why he was looking for her. After all, he himself told her to leave. He told me not to get it. Kieran left her. The lord was surprised. What did he mean? He didn't understand what the siren was talking about. Therefore, he suggested we talk in the castle. Ondine squeezed his hand and said no. If he didn't leave her then, if he really didn't give up on her. Melusine wanted to check whether his lordship could really become her serenade. So the girl kissed him. She wanted a child from him. The kiss became more passionate. The lord began to caress the mermaid's hips. He kissed her neck from behind, continuing to caress her with his hand. In her ear he muttered the question, how dare she think about escaping? The horse continued to move. Triton hugged the siren even tighter. He told her not to dare even entertain such thoughts. He won't let her. The nymph trembled all over from his caresses. Melusine asked to stop. She was too fast and scared. But Kieran advised to hold on tight because he is nearby, after which he kissed her passionately.